tackling poverty and achieving growth is about more than aid or even money.
David Cameron talking here about poverty in Liberia. However, in some parts of the UK, nearly half of children there are living in poverty. New statistics from End Child Poverty have shown that 3.6 million children in the UK live below the poverty threshold. The areas worst affected are Manchester Central, Glasgow North East and Belfast West, but the figures also show a stark divide within constituencies too. In London, Tower Hamlets has a child poverty rate of 42%, compared to just 7% in Richmond. Many of the places with high poverty levels are also areas with a high proportion of Muslims. The Department for Work and Pensions said it was taking a new approach by tackling the root causes, including worklessness, educational failure and family breakdown. However, campaign groups have complained that the government's decision to restrict increases in benefits will badly impact families with children. All the main political parties are signed up to eradicating child poverty by 2020. Poverty estimates fluctuate year on year. However, the Institute for Fiscal Studies estimates that the number of children in poverty is set to rise by several 100,000 by the end of the decade. Charlotte Hawkins, Islam Channel.
And so what's happening now with the government's proposal to amend the way in which poverty is defined? Is this, Kate, in your view, is this simply a way of massaging the figures?
I mean, the government's put out a consultation on how we should best measure child poverty. They haven't announced the results of that consultation yet, and obviously we're looking forward to kind of seeing what those results are. One thing that's really important to note is that we do have a Child Poverty Act in this country, which means that the government's accepted responsibility for tackling child poverty. It does see it as everybody's business. And that Act set out 4 different measures of child poverty in legislation passed with cross-party support. And I think it's very important that the government, whatever other measures of child poverty it decides to adopt, that it sticks to those measures which it agreed to in 2010 in the Child Poverty Act, and around which there's a wide international academic kind of popular consensus.
I mean, Imran, the way you were talking just now about looking at this in a sort of from a different angle, is that the government's point of view? Do you agree that there is in some way a weakness in the way in which the statistics are looked at the moment?
Well, one of the pieces of research that the Conservatives have just come out with recently has shown that poverty needs to be considered from other aspects and other angles rather than just a family's income. So, for example, where a family has a man or a woman who is addicted to drugs, for example, that has a huge impact and is one of the leading indicators of child poverty. So there are a whole load of social indicators which need to be taken into account of. But of course, a family's income is critical.
I mean, I think I just have to dispute that point about drugs and alcohol. The government just answered a parliamentary question saying it has no idea how many parents who are poor are addicted to drugs and alcohol. Our absolutely best estimates for the whole population are less than 4% of people kind of having really problematic drug and alcohol abuse. Whereas we've got 20% of people living in poverty. It's absolutely not a key. Of course, for families who've got drug and alcohol problems, that is terrible, that's affecting their lives. But to say that that's a key cause of child poverty, fortunately, just isn't right.
Well, I mean, you certainly put on an argument about why that might not be the case. But I mean, it is true to say that those children who come from families where their parents are alcoholics or drug addicts very much suffer in comparison to the rest of their peers. When I say it's a key challenge, it certainly is, insofar as there are a whole range of social indicators that need to be looked at. But I mean, there's no question that where a child comes from a family and their parents have gambling problems or drug addiction problems, the first thing that needs to be tackled in the interests of the child is their parents' addiction.
Absolutely, and it's a
hang on a minute, let's just unpack this a little bit, because this is a critical point of debate, really. And I mean, I think we all understand that the government has an attitude towards the poor that which is almost echoes a kind of Victorian attitude that they've got certain social problems and really they ought to pull their socks up and stop drinking so much and spending their money on bad things and so forth and so on. But isn't that simply a way of avoiding a more fundamental problem, which is if you haven't got a job, you're in trouble, and this may well cause a number of these problems rather than those problems being the cause of poverty.
Well, that's certainly very colourful language, and it's very easy to cast this kind of imagery against the Conservatives because it's a bit of a cheap shot. The fact is, the Centre for Social Justice, which is a very well-known and respected think tank by Ian Duncan Smith, has gone into some considerable detail looking into the key indicators of social inequality. And he has shown, and the think tank has shown, that where families come together and act as a cohesive unit and encourage their children both at school and at home, for example, those children will prosper.
I mean, I don't think we probably shouldn't spend too much time kind of trading research, basically, but I think there is a real problem of assuming that kind of levels of poverty in this country are about some kind of individual behaviour. I mean, let's just take kind of international comparisons. There's, I think, 34 countries in the OECD. We come 23rd in a level of child poverty. Do we really think that that's explained by different levels, because our parents are behaving differently in this country rather than elsewhere? I think we've really got to look at the more fundamental issues. Our very high cost of childcare. We've got some of the most expensive childcare in Europe, which is really stopping parents go out to work. We've still got incredibly high housing costs, and that's a real issue here in London, which we know is driving child poverty rates. We've got a labour market that's not necessarily working for parents, so it means parents can't get the jobs they want. And I think it's those kind of big issues, which are really difficult to tackle, that we really need to look at, as well as, of course, looking at the issues faced by individual families. Nobody at all is saying that, a family who's facing drug and alcohol addictions doesn't need a lot of help and support. But I think that if we think that by solving that family's problem, we're going to solve the kind of wider problem of child poverty, we're probably missing a trick.
Well, I certainly, I think at some extent we are both in agreement with each other. Surely there is no one solution to the fix. But, let's be clear. Those people who can go out to work must go out to work. Those people who have children, should recognise that, they have a duty to make sure that their own children prosper. And so I really take issue with the idea of the Conservatives as Victorian in some way, because actually it's the Conservatives that have come up with this consultation, which I think you yourself have as acknowledged as having some important value. Now, of course, just looking at the family background, isn't going to fix everything. But at the same time, we do have to recognise that, to use a well-used phrase, we are all in it together, and actually it takes each and one of us to act. So let's not try to make this problem as if it is a them and an us. Actually, in this society, whether you are working within a big company or whether you are a postman, together, only if we all and kind of act within the society to make it work and combat child poverty, we can do something about it.
I mean, I should stress that it wasn't me accusing the Conservatives of being Victorian at all, but certainly nobody wants to return to Victorian levels of poverty. I think one thing that's kind of interesting that I was thinking about when we say we're all in it together, unfortunately families with children out of any group are those who've seen their benefits cut largest. So if you look at the figures that the Institute for Fiscal Studies have produced, they've shown that if you're a family with children, you're more likely to be experiencing cuts in your income than any other type, than whether you're a single adult, whether you're a pensioner. And I think that's what we're really highlighting. Surely when we passed the Child Poverty Act, we agreed, as you said, that we should all be in this together, and this should absolutely be a priority, that we need to kind of put the prospects of children first. And I think unfortunately at the moment what we're seeing is the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who don't really have a kind of they've got no interest in saying that child poverty figures are going to rise if they're not, really warning of these really very dangerous rises in child poverty. And that's really what, with this report, what we're trying to highlight and say, let's collectively look for the solutions to tackle this.
I mean, I'm a little bit puzzled by the we're all in it together issue when it's brought together with the question of child poverty, because manifestly we aren't all in it together. If you're rich, by definition, you're not facing the question of child poverty. Only the poor face the question of child poverty. So can you kind of run that argument past us again?
I think it's an extraordinary thing to say, to suggest that those people, just because they have some money, just because they have a comfortable lifestyle, for that reason, they have no interest about those people who are less well off than them. In fact, the financial services industry, the banking industry, for example. Actually, if you go into these companies, you can see for yourselves how internally they raise each year hundreds of thousands of pounds for charity, which their workers just give out of the benefit for society. So what I would suggest is that it isn't helpful to try and polarize society with the and so you have the rich who are not interested in children's rights and the poor who will take all the benefits and mess up our system.
I mean, I really agree with you. I don't think this is an issue that any one group of society should particularly care about. And if you look at the evidence on the impacts of child poverty, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, for example, said that child poverty costs the economy around £25 billion a year. So of course it is in everybody's interest to tackle it. I think what we need to talk about though is not who cares about it, but who's going to do something about it. And I think we're asking, one of the reasons as well for putting out this report was to highlight that action can be taken at the local level. So particularly what local authorities might be able to do around high levels of child poverty in their own area.
And so you're responding to the government's proposals here. Well, what is your response? Just to outline.
So the government suggested that you have this way of measuring child poverty where you look at people's experiences in a number of different areas. So you look at their health, you look at their housing, you look at whether they're out of work, you look, for example, at the issues you raised about whether they might be addicted, have substance misuse problems. And they're saying you put them all into one big measure, basically, and you come up with a single number, which I don't know. One of the things we're saying, is to say, of course, look at those things. They're very interesting. But what we need to do is separate the causes of poverty from the consequences of poverty. And we need to keep those concepts separate in order to understand what we should actually do.
So, and in your response, I mean, you talked about the way in which the austerity measures are affecting these things. How big a causal factor on its own, if you can isolate a single factor, do you think that joblessness is?
I think if you look at the critical, if you want to say, what's the quickest way of deciding if somebody is likely to be poor or not poor, whether they've got a job or not, is obviously the key factor. But we need to look not just at the overall levels of jobs in the economy, but who's able to get those jobs. And I thought you were making some really interesting points about the levels of discrimination we see against some minority ethnic groups, which stops them having access to jobs at the lower level or at the higher level. And I think you also see issues. I was raising the issue of childcare about, even if there are jobs in your local area, are you actually able to take those jobs up by the time you've paid for the cost of childcare? Or in London, we see very high levels of child poverty, and we know also transport costs are playing a big issue there. If you've got to travel to zone 6 in order to be able to get a relatively low paid job, it starts looking much less worth it. And I think it's so we do absolutely need to look at the overall level of jobs in the economy, but we also need to be looking at who's able to take up those jobs, whether it's a issue about discrimination or whether it's about an issue about whether they're actually going to be better off when they take them up.
And in terms of this, do you think that the government does need to recalibrate what it's doing? Because quite clearly, George Osborne has had to considerably lengthen the time on which the projections of any economic turnaround are likely to happen. We're now faced with the possibility of a triple dip recession. Is there a plan B?
Well, I think, it's well known. I mean, this whole plan A, plan B business is again trying to polarize opinion. And I think everyone knows that the economy isn't about having a quick fix. But certainly in terms of addressing the issue about the growing numbers of the Muslim community who have lack of access to jobs and opportunities, it isn't about waiting for George Osborne to come up with a magic plan or anyone else. It's about making sure that those people who most need jobs have the best access to them. And one of the key indicators for social mobility has always been, and I believe always will be, education. Now, it is a fact that those children at home who get additional attention from their parents and get extra confidence in their reading and writing when they go to school will be far stronger candidates whilst they are there. So I think, of course, there are a number of macroeconomic issues which we need to take into account. Of course, if the economy is weak, that's going to impact on Muslim communities, and their child poverty levels. But at the same time, whilst we are waiting for the bigger picture to heal, And that, at an individual level, I'm not sure that we as individuals can influence the exchange rate or change the LIBOR or what have you. What we can do as individuals, as families and as communities together, is to work with our children and to make sure that their overall levels of literacy are high. So at least when the opportunities do come, they'll be best positioned to take advantage of them.
I mean, I think of course, everybody wants the best for their children. They want them to kind of do well at school. And actually, one of the interesting things in London actually is about how quickly kind of educational attainment has improved over the last 10 years. But one of the reasons for really caring about poverty is that it really affects how parents are able to support their children. So if you think about not being able to afford to send your kids on the school trips, for example, perhaps not having access to the internet at home, which is really kind of increasingly a critical part of learning, perhaps living in cramped accommodation, which means it's harder to find a kind of safe space to do your homework. These are some of the ways in which poverty really affects kind of children's chances of learning. And we know across the board that of course, many, many poor children go on to do absolutely brilliantly at school, but kind of on average, if you grow up in a poor household, you're less likely to do well. And that's one of the real reasons why we're so concerned about it, why we bang on about child poverty. It's not just because, it's a convenient thing for us to talk about. We care about it because it has such an impact on children's educational outcomes and their futures.
Well, I totally agree with you. I mean, I think all of us in society are concerned about child poverty, and where there's room for improvement, we should act upon those things, and we should do those. But I don't know if you've ever been to Pakistan or India before, Kate. I don't know. Have you been there? Well, I thoroughly recommend you go there as a worthy trip in its own right. But if you want to see child poverty, I suggest you go there as a good case study, because what you'll see walking down the streets in really just any road within Pakistan, in India, are limbless children on rollerboards walking around.
Is that really our comparison? We're one of the richest countries in the world. Are we really saying we can't keep the levels? Let's look at why. If you want to see a lack of child poverty, we could go to France, we could go to Norway, we could go to Denmark, where, with very similar incomes to us, they achieve far lower levels of child poverty.
Sweden, Norway and Denmark are very culturally homogenous, non-post-colonialist society. So you can't really use them as a good example.
What about kind of countries like France and Germany, for example, who, obviously France in particular was a colonial society and does manage to achieve lower levels of child poverty than us. I mean, the UK is pretty much at the bottom of kind of Europe as a kind of, when you take away kind of some of the new accession Eastern European.
How is France doing in the international political economy? It's not doing very well. So, I mean, I don't think France is a great example.
I mean, there's lots of good evidence to show there's no trade-off between economic success and poverty levels.
The reason I'm saying this is not to say that we should compare ourselves to India and Pakistan. What I would say is that, in Britain, we do have opportunities here, and, there are avenues which you can go down to try and improve yourself. And, we have a great welfare system here, and there are opportunities for children who are on the poverty line not to die of starvation. Now, in India and Pakistan, that's not the case. So I'm not saying that just because in India and Pakistan they have huge amounts of poverty and so we don't have a problem. But I would say let's put this into a bit of perspective.
I mean, to be honest, that is really not an argument that's going to fly, is it? I mean, I respect the opinion, but I can't really see David Cameron going to the electorate and say, listen, guys, don't worry, we haven't hit third world levels yet, so enjoy. It's not an argument, is it?
I mean, I think, there's probably if you're a child, let's say you're choosing where to be born in the world, basically, probably kind of on average, you might choose to be born in London if you're kind of worried about your poverty levels rather than in India. If what you're kind of worried about is, what are your prospects of not being poor? But then within London, there's such a huge gap between whether you're born into a rich family or a poor family. And I think that's the gap we're really worried about. And I think it's a kind of lack of ambition, basically, to say, well, we're better off than, kids in London are better off than kids in, somewhere in India. I just don't think that kind of...
Well, I'm not suggesting for a second that, it's some kind of policy ambition that we need to compare ourselves to India.
Well, that's a good point to bring the conversation to a rest. I'm glad that we've got consensus at least on that issue. Do join us for the second part of the Politics and Media programme where we're discussing the closure of the prayer room at City University in London.